Chennai. Around 2:30 in the morning. Couldn't sleep so decided to have a smoke, which in hindsight doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Obviously couldn't smoke at home, so took a long stroll towards the Besant Nagar beach. While I was walking, a pack of stray dogs started following me. They were not scary looking, so I didn't mind. Hey, good company, I thought. About 10 minutes into the walk, one of the dogs started barking at me. I looked behind at them, and when I did, they immediately sat down on the street. Not one or two, all four of them, like they were programmed or something. Well, that was weird, I thought. I turned back ahead and started walking again, and the same thing happened within seconds. Bark, look towards me, and sit. I didn't know what the fuck was happening, but it started to creep me out a bit. This happened the entire time I was walking towards the beach, about 8 to 10 times. I then remembered the nonsense my mom used to tell me about how ghosts roam during the 3 a.m. hour and how dogs can sense spirits. I don't believe in stuff like that, but what was happening to me at that point, I couldn't just chalk it up to coincidence. Then out of nowhere, I started feeling a wave of chillness wash over me. I was nowhere near the beach at this point, so I couldn't use that as an excuse, and this was happening in Chennai, in the middle of summer. When I saw that my hands started shivering, I was like, fuck this, and booked it back home, along with the dogs right behind me. To this day, I keep wondering what might have happened if those dogs weren't following me on that particular night. But I still don't believe in ghosts, though.
For some reason, I never thought about posting my story here. I posted it on YouTube comments before, and I think I've even talked about it on my YouTube show before, unrelated to paranormal. I interview families with missing children or family members to help get the word out and bring them home. I am a very normal, simple, 41-year-old guy with zero history of any mental illness apart from a little bit of anxiety. No bad medical history, drug use, etc. Drank in my teens and 20s when I would go out to bars and stuff, but never had any bad habits or anything like that. Anyway, it started when I was 5 or 6, which would have been 1988, 1989. I would see what I called the bloody man walking up and down the stairs in my house. I can't remember his face. Not sure if it's because I never looked at it or he didn't have one. I just remember it would never be middle of the night, but more like bedtime that this would always happen. He had a bandage on his head that was bloody, and a hospital gown. I remember having a feeling that I knew this wasn't right, but I wasn't scared. Not sure if the lack of fear was due to being told not to be scared somehow, or if I was so young I just didn't know to be scared. Anyway, this person I would see, I would come to learn later in life, was my uncle. He had been beaten in the head with a baseball bat, came home, brain swelled in his sleep, and was taken to the hospital by the family in the morning, where he died several days later. This was August of 1982. I was born in December of 1983. There's much more to the story, both his life and that night itself, but I'll hold off on that for now. I saw the bloody man somewhere in the range of 15 to maybe 30 times. Then my mom and I moved out of there to get our own place. This was my grandfather's house, and I was gone for 5 years. Around 12 or 13 years old, I moved back to that house. While I never saw the bloody man again, it was far from the last paranormal encounter I would have in that house. After being back around 5-6 months or so, one day I was showing my little sister how to play a Sonic the Hedgehog game, and as I'm explaining it to her, as clear as day, a female voice says her name. My sister instantly got up and went to the door and said, "Yama?" And I was frozen solid in fear. This was for 2 reasons. The first was I knew for a fact that that wasn't my mom's voice that said my sister's name. It was my grandmother's, who had been dead for 10 years. The second thing I knew that my little sister didn't seem to realize, the voice had not come from downstairs. It came from right at our feet by the foot of the bed. I just sat there frozen in fear while my sister yelled for my mom, who of course said she had been washing dishes and never called her. My sister then sulked while walking back to the bed. "What's the matter?" I asked her. She said, "I hate those stupid stairs. The bloody man is scary." So I started asking her who had told her about the bloody man, was it any of my friends, etc., etc. She was in shock that I knew who the bloody man was and was crying for me to believe her that she really sees him, and none of my friends had spilled the secret to her. She was about 5 at this time, same age I used to see him. The next part of this story involves all my friends. Every sleepover, after hearing my grandmother's voice, my bedroom door started shaking. Thinking it might be my stepfather, we would open it as it was shaking, and no one would be standing there. Upon realizing this, the shaking would terrify us, so every sleepover for about a year, the door would shake and these horrible claw-like scratching sounds would go down the door. My friends and I would fight to hide in the corner on the bed while it would happen. So if you're keeping count, that's me and my sister, who both saw the bloody man and heard the female voice, and 3 of my friends who witnessed the shaking and clawing at the door. 5 people. But believe it or not, the last part of the story gets even crazier. We sold the house and moved a couple cities over about a year later. One thing I forgot to mention is the reason I moved back at 12-13 is my grandfather had a bunch of mini strokes and was in a wheelchair, so my mom moved back in to take care of him. Well, after we moved away, I told my mom it surprised me that she sold her childhood house, and she talked about all the bad memories she had there that had replaced the good. And then she said, plus, Grampy started creeping me out towards the end. It turns out he had started telling her, "Your brother's still here, every night, up and down those goddamn stairs, up and down, up and down." He saw the bloody man too, his son. But that's not the craziest part. About 7 or 8 years after selling the house, the guy that bought it saw my uncle in a gym and beelined it towards him, demanding to know, what the hell is in that house? He, his wife, and 2 of his kids kept seeing my uncle around the house. I made it a point to walk by the house to try to catch someone coming out once I heard the gym story, and one day I caught the youngest son leaving. I introduced myself and asked him about what they saw, and he said he was too young at the time, but his mom, dad, and 2 brothers would always see my uncle behind them in mirrors in the house. They got rid of the mirrors and it stopped, he said. I don't quite understand that part because mirrors had nothing to do with it for me, but still, that's 3 people in my family, 3 friends, and 4 people of a different family that essentially saw the same thing or heard it. I'd give anything to learn exactly what the heck went on in that house all those years. Anyway, that's my story.
When I was a kid, my favorite uncle was the youngest in the family. He was my hero. He had just finished high school, and I was like 10 or 11. We would go and visit on spring break and over the course of the summer, and I always looked forward to seeing the guy. We'd listen to records and tapes, and he introduced me to bands like The Cult and In-X, The Doors, Bowie, Stevie Ray Vaughan. As I entered my teenage years, my life started, and my friends became the center of my universe, and those spring break and summer visits eventually stopped happening. Eventually, I graduated high school, and around the same time, my uncle started a family. A few years out of high school, and my mom called me up and let me know my uncle had passed away. I hadn't seen him in a few years, and when I asked what happened, the only reply I could get was, he was sick. It wasn't until years later I found out he had taken his own life. He didn't leave a note or anything, but the general consensus was he learned he didn't have long to live and took the easy way out. Here's where things get interesting for me. Shortly after the funeral, I start having dreams. I'm a pretty lucid dreamer, not in the sense that I can decide what I want to happen in a dream, but I can recall my dreams in vivid detail. Maybe there's another word for that. I don't know. Anyways, I started having dreams about my uncle. Sometimes we were just sitting in his room from when I was a kid, listening to music and making jokes. Over time, they became very strange. One dream I had, we were in a movie theater, sitting really close to the screen, and we were eating popcorn. The screen was playing something, but I couldn't distinguish what it was, and my uncle was talking, but I could not figure out what he was trying to say. Another was the 2 of us in a hallway, and all the doors were locked. The most troubling dream I had about the guy, which was also the most recurring, is when I would find him sitting at a rope bridge. He would stare at this bridge and get up and try to walk across it, but there's snakes that would strike at him when he tried to cross. A snake would snip at him and he'd go back to where he was sitting and just look at me, then look at the bridge. So I'd walk onto this bridge and look across, and every few feet is a very angry snake, all the way across. I grabbed my uncle's hand and took him out on the bridge, and he would be apprehensive because of the snakes. So I stood in front of him and kind of hopped up and down on the bridge. The momentum, or whatever you call it, from me bouncing on this rickety old bridge made the snakes angry, but if you bounced enough on it, the snakes would eventually teeter over the side. It was a very strange eureka kind of dream. So my uncle would step out onto the bridge, walk a few feet, bounce the bridge so the snakes would fall off. The dream would always end with my uncle making it across the bridge and me getting this feeling of reluctance to follow him across. Then I would wake up with this overwhelming feeling of sadness. These dreams happened for almost 20 years, always the same, me and my uncle shooting the shit or me helping him solve a puzzle of some sort. The snake and rope bridge was the most common. Never told a soul in my family about what my uncle and I were up to. I always thought it would be upsetting, like he wasn't at rest, like he was in purgatory or something. Maybe he was. I eventually just came to accept that my uncle was haunting me, and for the most part, I didn't mind. My grandmother died a few years ago. Nothing tragic, she caught pneumonia and never really recovered from it. One night she went to sleep and never woke up. We celebrated her life, hugged and healed the way families do when death comes to visit. Since my grandmother's funeral, I haven't had a single dream about my uncle. Not one. I think that was the confirmation I needed that there's something out there for us after we die. Or maybe my grandmother passing away was the catharsis I needed to let my uncle go. I look back on it now, and I like to think that my uncle was just lost. He was lost in life, and that carried on in death. I also think my grandmother, on her way to the sweet hereafter, found her baby boy, picked him up, dusted him off, and brought him home.
Sorry all who read this before. I repost my story for engagement on these threads. It's also long because I have never told a short story in my life. My wife hates it. Obligatory. I know this sounds fantastical and wild, and I agree. This is in fairly remote backcountry West Virginia, which is known for being old and haunted. It was experienced entirely by 2 of us, but the worst parts by all 4. This led to all 4 of us at some point battling personal issues in our lives that I believe stemmed directly from this encounter. The following is, at least to my memory, and what I've been able to corroborate with the other people that were there, 100% accurate and true. When I was 17, 2004, we had a bad experience camping near haunted train tunnels and sites of sudden tragic death. History of immediate, 1 square mile area, mother and son drowning in the creek nearby, old man hung himself from this old dead tree that hung over the water. Cliché, creepy dead hanging tree, I know. Drug dealers killed in state police shootout at a nearby hunting cabin, and many, many years before, cheap laborers had been killed building this double set of train tunnels. They were actually buried in a long-forgotten little graveyard nearby the tunnels that has since been found and restored. We decided to go camping before graduation as a friend group of 4 just to do something one last time before we all went our separate ways in life. This is private property on the backside of a big forested hill around which the creek flows in a huge, several-mile-long bend. Camp set up, fire going. Shortly after nightfall, my cousin and I sat on the creek bank maybe 20 yards away from camp, spotlighting fish in the water. We began to hear a rhythmic slosh, slosh of what sounded like someone wading through the water maybe halfway up their shin deep, so we shined the light around upstream. We then spotted the symmetrically and rhythmically consistent disturbance made by what looked and sounded like invisible feet or legs sloshing towards us. When we would turn our spotlight off, it would start. It would stop when illuminated. It was reacting to us. And this was the first ice bucket stomach clench moment we knew this was not fish and could not rationalize what was happening.
This scared us pretty badly, but we decided best to keep it to ourselves and join the others gathered at the fire. As we made our way back, we heard the sloshing make it to where we were on the bank, and the noise stopped. Given the speed we witnessed it moving and how far it was from us when we were watching it, it must have sped up to make it to the bank we were on in the amount of time it took us to get back to camp. Others at the camp heard it as well and figured we had either gotten in or somehow riled up some fish, but we just played it off. It sounded and looked like an invisible person wading towards us through the water. After the noise ended at the creek bank, we all saw the tall grass disturbed as something we couldn't see ran around the foliage perimeter of our circularly cleared campsite. This could have been an animal, but it was fast. We then began to hear what sounded like a man talking to us, as in speaking into the ear of each person, the left ear if that matters. At first it sounded garbled, but after maybe 20 to 25 seconds, we could make out the words saying we shouldn't be there and we needed to leave, before finally addressing us directly and saying slightly more forcefully, "You need to leave." Obviously, this was terrifying, and at first we thought there was a person or group of people out there walking up on our camp, and that is dangerous. We were all frozen with fear, but then adrenaline hit. As we freaked out and started to run to our ATV, all four of us saw a tall black shadow man wearing what looked like a hat relaxing against the front of our ATV. It straightened up when we saw it, and it saw us, and it just sort of hung there staring at us for a few seconds. No feet. The legs ended in sort of wavy lines like looking above the fire at the heat waves. It stood out against the dark night behind it. The girl screamed, which broke our fear freeze, and it zipped, like the Flash, back towards the train tunnels people had died in. Interestingly, when we went to start the ATV, it turned over sluggishly, as if the battery had been slightly drained, despite working fine not long before when we rode it down. This entire event happened over the course of maybe 5 to 10 minutes and within an hour of the sun going down. After putting our story out there, I received a lot of feedback from people who have also had bad encounters in this area over many years. Even a guy I worked with, who I didn't know knew this area, told me that my uncle had hired him to trap in that area, and it was the only place he didn't check traps alone at night. He said it was almost like the animals leave that place at night. No less than a month later, my uncle, who owns the property, was up on the hill raccoon hunting at night with a dog. At some point, the dog was on a rock face up above him, knocked a large rock loose that fell, and struck my uncle in the side of the neck. This understandably messed him up pretty badly and paralyzed almost his entire body, but he still had limited functionality on his left side. We could never figure out how he got himself back to his ATV and turned it around and drove himself out of there. It wasn't until probably 2 or 3 years later, around Halloween when my story makes its rounds on the local Facebook groups, that my uncle texted my mother out of the blue. You have no reason to believe my uncle's character reference, but he is a salt-of-the-earth, hunting, farming, working man, even working past his retirement as a millionaire. Honest, funny, just an incredibly stand-up guy. He's easygoing, but also no nonsense. In his text to my mother, he said, "I've never told anybody this before, and I probably won't again. The man in the hat the kids saw at the creek that night helped pick me up off the ground and put me back on my ATV and get me turned around." Until I heard that, I had always assumed that the shadow man was the one who was trying to scare us out of there, but thinking back on it, maybe he was the one who was whispering to us, telling us we needed to leave and possibly avoid something scarier and more dangerous, although I have no idea what could have been scarier than that.
One time when I was 16, I was preparing to go to sleep but couldn't fall asleep. It was a cold winter night. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing distant footsteps in the snow that were getting closer. That was already a little weird, I felt, at this hour and around these parts. But even weirder and scarier was the fact that the footsteps stopped right in front of my room's window. When I looked at my closed curtains, I saw a shadow just standing there. I was so scared that my immediate reaction was just to hide under the blankets. I must have stayed under the blankets for probably an hour straight, just waiting and hoping I would hear the person leaving, just waiting to hear the footsteps again, but there was no sound. So I kept thinking, They're still there. I was too scared to look again, so I just stayed under my blanket. Eventually, I fell asleep because I was too tired, but in the morning, I jumped out of bed, vividly remembering what happened. I ran upstairs and looked outside, and sure enough, there were footsteps in the snow, and they stopped right in front of my window, but went nowhere else. This confirmed it wasn't a dream. But now I was really confused. Why did someone stop here around 2-3 a.m., and what happened to them? I wanted to share this story on the No Sleep subreddit, but that place appears to be for made-up, silly stories only, and not real things that actually happened to us. As you can see, this is between real and paranormal. It could be just a normal person, and there could be an explanation for why there's no second trail of footsteps. Maybe they just retraced their steps, or it could be something paranormal. Of course, back then, this felt like something paranormal, but now that I'm older, I believe less in those things. But I still found this experience really interesting, and I often think about it.